Today, and the first one we're going to go through pretty quickly because it may not affect you right now, but it may have affected you in the past. It definitely affects your colleagues, and it may affect you in the future. That's the open door law or the open meeting law. We'll quickly go through that. I'll give just a bare bones overview of it and answer any questions you may have, and then we'll dive into the Access to Public Records Act. Those are the two statutes I deal with regularly, although access considerations are sprinkled out throughout the Indiana Code and not just in these two statutes. And when I started interviewing for this job and going through the process of being appointed by the governor, I spoke with several different public access counselors in the past. And I don't know what this says about me, but they all said, you know, after 6 months, you'll have seen and heard everything and you'll have this down to a science. That is not true. I see, as Debbie said, I see little wrinkles and nuances with almost every opinion, new fact patterns that are presented. So it's exciting for me after 14 months on the job to still see novel issues and fresh perspectives. And so that, for me, that makes it fulfilling. And I get to publish opinions on new things every week. So, and a lot of that has to do with the attentiveness of public officials to be mindful of what's going on as far as access and transparency is concerned. Definitely there's been, you know, an increased scrutiny on public officials recently, but you know, at the same, the other side of that token is that more and more folks are soliciting my advice as far as best practices and things like that, and I think that's really great. A brief overview of my office. It's a young office. It was only enacted in 1999 through the General Assembly. Governor O'Bannon responded to a group of newspapers. Their publishers and editors lobbied both the executive and the legislative branch to create an office of the public access counselor to serve as kind of an ombudsman, an independent agency overseeing and not regulating per se, but just being a resource for public officials and concerned citizens and members of the media who are trying to obtain access. We're a small office. It's just myself. I have an intern and I have an administrative assistant. Usually when you call, you'll get the administrative assistant. Her name is Dale. She is wonderful. She's been around longer than I do. I think she knows more than I do. So she it is extremely helpful if you call and I'm not available to answer any questions you may have. Now, we try, like I said, we want to make ourselves as accessible and approachable as possible, and we have seen a rise in just basic contact with the office. And we keep track of every single name and number that comes through our telephone lines, that goes over our email. We have a log. It's a very, very lengthy log, but it has and it's searchable. So we have the name and contact information for everyone who makes contact with our office. And for us, that's an invaluable resource, so that if something comes up in a community and we know we've spoken to someone in that community, we can reach out and work out issues, and we have a reference point for someone there who can we can work through, you know, through the process and things like that. This last year, we got about 3,000 different contacts, individual issues. Now, of those 3,000, about a tenth of them wind up in a situation where I issue some kind of formal or informal opinion. I do two different types of opinion. The first is the adversarial. Somebody complains that somebody's doing something wrong. So a member of the media or a constituent will actually write out a formal complaint. It's a set form that you can find online. That you know, a public official is either violating the Open Door Law or the Access to Public Records Act, and that will result in me issuing an opinion. I do about 300 of those a year. The other one, the other kind of opinion is more of an academic exercise, and usually that comes about by a public official themselves soliciting my advice on best practice or a hypothetical situation or something they know they're going to face in the future, and so they'll reach out to me and I'll issue more of an informal conversational opinion. It's not adversarial in nature, and I do about 50 of those a year, I would say. All of those opinions are available online. So if you're curious about an issue that you're facing, but not quite to the point of wanting to pick up the phone or sending me an email, it's a searchable database by keyword. So we'll talk about some some things today, and if you want to know more about, well, what is a reasonably particular request and what does that mean, you can type in reasonable particularity in our searchable database, and it'll come up with a number of opinions addressing that particular topic, and so you can read about what that might mean and how it might affect you. So very quickly, let's take about 10 or 15 minutes to go through the open door law. And again, if you have any questions, please raise your hand, get my attention, and we'll address that. But basically what the open door law means, if you're not familiar with it, is that any time a majority of a governing body meets to discuss public business, then that triggers the open door law. That has to be an open meeting unless some kind of exception applies. I start with the reference point that all meetings of majority of governing bodies are going to be open, and then we carve out exceptions from there. But the legislature has put into both the open door law and the Access to Public Records Act what I like to call a bit of a philosophical preamble. The Constitution of the United States, for example, has a preamble, we the people, that kind of thing. The General Assembly has done that in this case as well with these statutes to give the overall philosophy of the lawmakers when they were enacting this statute. And basically, as you see, it's so that official actions of public business be conducted openly and give the public the right to see or the opportunity to see how you act and operate. Now, that only comes about when there's a majority of a governing body. So if you have a city council, the 7-member city council, 3 of those 7 can meet to discuss public business in private or behind closed doors. But once that 4th one establishes a majority, then that is what triggers the open door law. And so all of those discussions would have to be open. And I get a lot of questions that say, well, yeah, we met, but we didn't vote, or we didn't take any final action, or we didn't make a decision. Well, that doesn't matter because the statute itself gives a very broad definition of what official action on public business means. And official action means anything, discussions, receiving information, making recommendations, all of those type of things, in any kind of communication back and forth with the majority of the body is going to trigger the open door law. And so it doesn't necessarily have to entail a voting situation or a final action anytime they meet to discuss public business. Now, that's important too, because I'll also get questions that say, well, Commissioners Smith, Jones, and Parker all attend the same church service, and we're all in the congregation at the same time, and they were discussing church business. Well, that's not public business. That's their own private business. Public officials that establish a quorum can go to the same church service. They can go to the same high school basketball game. It's only when they start to discuss public business, and what public business is it germane to their official capacity as public officials? Does it relate to what they do in an official capacity? And if it doesn't, if it's social, if it's non-public business, then they can meet to discuss those things. So with an open meeting, there's also a notice element. And this is where it gets a little bit nuanced and a little bit tricky, because there are certain notice requirements for some governing bodies, like county commissioners. County commissioners are a little different when it comes to notice. PETA BOAs are another example that are a little bit different. They have a heightened notice requirement. But by and large, most public agencies, most governing bodies are going to be subject to a 48-hour notice requirement. So they have to post physical notice on conspicuous at their place of the meeting. So if it's going to be at the town hall, they would put in a placard sometimes it's an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. Sometimes it's electronic signage. These days, that's becoming more and more ubiquitous. So it's perfectly acceptable to have alternative kind of notice as long as it's conspicuous to the public, and it has to include date, time, and location. And that's all a public notice has to include for a regular open meeting. And for some of those other agencies, some more that have more specific requirements, some of them have to publish in the paper a couple weeks before the meeting. But those are very, very specific instances. Budget hearings, like I said, PETA-BOA, things like that. And then county commissioners have a 10-day notice requirement, which is a little bit different than 48 hours. Now, with emergency situations, which happen, no notice is required. The meeting still has to be open, but if it's a true emergent circumstance, a governing body can hold a meeting without giving notice. But I've written some opinions here recently where governing bodies have really stretched the definition of emergency. And I've disagreed with them on what a true emergency is. It's not that you're going to miss a deadline that you've known about for a month and you have to convene to draft some kind of language in a document or vote on submitting a grant or something like that. That's not an emergency. An emergency is a true threat to either someone's physical safety, like say a school board needs to convene to talk about the pending snowstorm, the catastrophic snowstorm that's going to shut down the county. Well, they need to meet to decide whether to shut down school for the next day. That's an emergency. Or a tornado comes through and disrupts some kind of operation that affects the government. Well, that's an emergency. But things like missed deadlines or discussing issues that aren't emergencies, those don't rise to the level of not having to give notice. Question over here.
Can you tell me the difference then between the special meetings for county executives where it requires 6 days notice compared to a 48-hour notice on
So the question is the difference between 6-day notice or 10-day notice of county executives. County executives would be your county commissioners. So they require 10-day notice of their regularly scheduled meetings. 6-day notice is if they call a special meeting. So that's not an emergency situation. That's just they want to meet and they don't have time necessarily to have that 10-day notice, or it's not a regularly scheduled meeting. And so but they still have to give 6-day notice. But that only applies to county executives or county commissioners. So here's what a notice looks like. Pretty simple. Like I said, you can, as long as it's conspicuous and contains this kind of information, you're good to go when posting a notice. Agendas are a little tricky. This is a little nuance that is confuses a lot of folks, and it's frankly it's a little bit confusing to me as well. If you regularly post an agenda, you have to post an agenda. If you don't regularly post an agenda, you don't have to post an agenda. Now that comes right out of the statute. I'm not exactly sure what sense that makes, but that's the rule. So if you utilize one and the public has the expectation that there's going to be an agenda for the meeting, then you should go ahead and post that agenda. But if not, then there's no requirement. Now, usually when I get questions about agendas, my kind of best practice advice is that, yeah, you can deviate from an agenda, but if it's going to be a big controversial vote and you haven't put that on an agenda and haven't advertised that topic as ripe for a vote, table that until you have an opportunity to do so. Don't do a spur-of-the-moment vote at a meeting out of the blue that kind of blindsides the interested public. Those kinds of things. If it can't wait, that's one thing. But if it can, then best practice would be to go ahead and advertise that as being scheduled for the next time around. Executive sessions are the exception to the open door law, the only time a majority of a body can meet to discuss public business. And there are very, very specific subject matter instances when someone can meet behind closed doors as a majority, or when a body can meet behind closed doors. And they are laid out, they are enumerated in the open door law. There are 13 or 14 of them, and they're very, very specific. And not only do you have to post the regular notice of, like you would for an open meeting, you also have to say specifically why you're holding that meeting and what you're going to talk about and what statute authorizes that. And I'll show you an example of what a good executive session notice looks like. But the point is that when I get complaints about executive sessions, I scrutinize those complaints very closely to make sure that the governing body has dotted all its I's and crossed all its T's when it came to things like notice and the minutes afterwards and things like that, because those are the only times when somebody can meet, when a body can meet in private behind closed doors. So that's a very special circumstance. Executive sessions should be used judiciously, although I know that they're regularly scheduled and some agencies have standing executive sessions before each open meeting. I don't necessarily condone that, although there's not anything legally wrong with it. I just think that executive session should be used sparingly and judiciously only when it's truly needed. So, but that said, I know a lot of agencies do have a standing executive session, and that's okay. I just caution agencies to use that judiciously. Not only, for regular meetings, minutes have to be taken, and those are the detailed blow-by-blow minutes you're all familiar with, where it says, who's there, a narrative of what was discussed, things like that. With executive sessions, it would kind of defeat the purpose to have that kind of narrative if you're meeting behind closed doors to talk about a sensitive matter. So it's, for minutes for an executive session, all it has to say is that we met, who was present, that no final action was taken, and that we only discussed the subject matter that was noticed. That's and a certification that happened, and that certification can just be a signature. But it's important to note that you do have to have minutes for an executive session. It does have to certify that the subject matter authorized by the statute was the only thing discussed. So this is an example of an improper executive session notice. And if you look down at the end, it's improper because it's very, very vague about what's going to be discussed. Personnel and litigation. Well, what kind of personnel? What kind of litigation? There are specific instances or specific kinds of personnel issues that can be discussed. Performance issues is one. You can talk about that, but you can't talk about compensation behind closed doors. So just saying personnel isn't enough to give the public notice of what you're going to be talking about. Whereas this next one is specific, and it does meet those specificity requirements. It's very particular in what's going to be discussed. It actually cites the statute that authorizes it, and that's appropriate. And your minutes are going to look almost exactly like this. You're not going to say exactly the detail of what was discussed, but you're going to cite the statute. This is what was discussed. We met to discuss job performance of an individual employee as authorized by the statute, and that's going to be good enough for your minutes. So here are some examples of when executive sessions this isn't a comprehensive list, but of when they can be held. If you're going to be discussing confidential information, if you have confidential financial information and you need to meet with the county council or the commissioners to discuss that kind of thing, you can hold an executive session to discuss that. That's fine. Misconduct of an employee or performance of an employee, you can discuss those things. And things like that are going to be a little more sensitive than the regular subject matter that's subject to an open meeting. The law has carved out some exceptions. Okay. Just a quick couple things about the open door law. Doesn't mean that the public necessarily has the right to speak at an open meeting. I get a lot of complaints about, well, my First Amendment rights were compromised because I wasn't able to speak at a public meeting. Well, that's not really what that means. The public has the right to attend, and they have the right to record, but they don't necessarily have the right to speak. Now, a lot of agencies extend the opportunity to speak in a forum, or have a sign-up list. The first 5 people that sign up have 5 minutes to air their grievances or discuss a topic with the board. And that's great, that's fine. I encourage that. I think all governing bodies should do that. But there are times when a public forum for comment during the course of a meeting is not appropriate. And there's no obligation that a board or a council have that opportunity available, although it's good practice to do that, but sometimes just the circumstances prevent that kind of dialogue, that kind of interaction with the public, and so that's fine. No secret ballots. It doesn't have to be a roll call, but it has to be at least a yay, nay, go around the table, and so the public knows who's voting so they can see with their eyes who's voting for what. And then electronic meetings. For state agencies, we have the opportunity to, if I sit on, for example, the Oversight Committee on Public Records, and we have members from Evansville, we have members from Gary and Fort Wayne, and they're not going to drive down to the State House for a 20, 30-minute meeting. So they patch in through teleconference or sometimes, if they have the capability, video conference. For state agencies, that's fine, because it's contemplated that you're going to have out-of-state folks that want to participate in the meeting. But for local agencies, for county and municipality agencies, that's not the case. It's expected that it's reasonable that they're going to be able to make it to the town hall for the meeting. And so while they still have the opportunity to phone in and participate, they can't vote over those electronic means if on the local level, and they can't be counted as presence to establish a quorum. So it's like they're an interested observer at that point if they patch in through video or telephone. But they're not authorized to take any kind of final action if they do that. Okay, any questions about the open door law before I move on? Yes, one in the back. Yes, for the question was about the minutes after the meeting. What has to be contained in those minutes. The only thing that needs to be in there: date, time, location of the meeting, who was present, the authorization, the statutory authorization for the discussion, and a certification that was the only thing discussed. And those are the elements for an executive session meeting. Doesn't have to be a blow-by-blow detailed narrative of the conversation. Just the overall purpose of the meeting and the statute that authorizes it. That's all. Anything else about open door law? Oh, okay, one more.
Is there anything in the law that states that you don't release the minutes while they are in draft form?
Okay, so the question is about draft minutes, and that's a good question. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the Access to Public Records Act portion, but draft minutes are going to be, the way I describe them, are working documents. They're not finalized until they're voted on the next time around. And so a lot of times it will be the impression of the note taker or the minute taker to their observations of the meeting, and then other council people weigh in on that, and that changes. It's fluid throughout the process. But prior opinions have held, and I haven't weighed in on this, but prior opinions have held that draft minutes are disclosable public record, and they're not what we consider deliberative material. That's kind of been the trend. Now, I haven't addressed it directly again, but I'd be willing to take a second look at it. So what I'm saying is that it's kind of up in the air at this point. I would say to err on the side of disclosability, but there could be a justification made for withholding those. It just depends on the circumstance. But as a rule, I guess, draft minutes would be disclosable. Yes?
Can the commissioners meet with the highway department?
And
Not in the
so the question is, can commissioners meet with the highway department that's not in a meeting? Sometimes those would be considered like an administrative meeting, just to receive updates on what the department's doing and things like that. The commissioners aren't really taking action on public business because they don't necessarily have any authority to take action on those issues. They're just more for their own edification, getting information. That kind of situation is fine. They can meet with department heads and things like that. That's more in an administrative capacity. Those meetings still have to be open, but they don't. Notice doesn't have to be given. Commissioners especially, because they're only 3-member bodies, so that makes it very difficult for them to have those kinds of meetings and go through the process of posting notice every single time. But those types of administrative meetings are fine. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
Are committee meetings such as personnel, GIS, those type meetings, do those have to be noticed?
It depends what kind of, well, the question is about committee meetings. It depends what kind of committee it is. If it's, are you talking about like a subcommittee of a council or a board? Usually, yes, those have to be open and notice has to be required because that forms a new governing body and it's still a public agency. And even though they're tasked with a specific issue and they have authority to discuss only certain things, the law says that subcommittees, delegations, boards within boards are also subject to the open door law. Well, so say a 7-member council delegates 3 of their members to discuss a certain issue, performance or something like that, an exploratory committee. Though it now becomes a 3-member board, a whole new 3-member board. And so if anytime 2 of those 3 discuss public business, then that's going to trigger the open door law. Yeah. Anything else? Anybody else? One more.
I think you touched on this, but I couldn't hear you. Did you talk about if a commissioner isn't at a meeting and he's by telephone? Did you say something about that?
Yes.
Would you restate that for us, please?
Yes. So if someone calls in over telephone, if they can't make it physically to the meeting and they're not in the same room as the other commission member, the other commissioners, they can participate, so they can call in and they can discuss issues, but they can't be counted present, and they can't participate in a vote. But they can participate in a discussion. Anything else? Okay, so let's move on to the Access to Public Records Act. And again, as you see, this also has a preamble that the General Assembly has given their overall philosophy on what it means for a public agency to have custody of information and what the public has the right to know. And it starts, and I start, with the premise that everything maintained, received, created, held by a public agency is public record. And then we carve out exceptions from there as far as what is and is not disclosable. But I start with the basic premise that everything's fair game, and then we carve out the exceptions. A lot of agencies do it the other way around. They create or maintain documents under the basic notion that, well, we don't have to give this out because it's deliberative, or it's law enforcement if it's investigatory, things like that. But I think the General Assembly intended for the statute to be read and for me to interpret it as everything's fair game, and then we carve out exceptions from there. And if you look at the definition of public record, usually what I do in smaller groups is I pose the question, can anyone give me an example of something that's held by an agency or maintained by an agency that is not public record? And inevitably, in every group, somebody's going to say, well, confidential financial information isn't public record, or trade secrets aren't public record. Well, they are public record. They're just not disclosable public record. And that's not playing with semantics. That's actually the case. If you look at the definition of public record, it's exhaustive, it's comprehensive. And then at the end, if there was any confusion over what is and isn't a public record, it says any other material regardless of form or characteristic. Everything is a public record. It's just not everything is a disclosable public record. And the way I see it, and what we'll discuss here briefly, is that there are three types of public records in my estimation. The first category is, anything goes. Budget, meeting minutes. That's all disclosable. There's no exception to the rule. The second is that it's been declared confidential by some kind of authority. So a federal or state statute has said, okay, personal health information is confidential, or trade secrets are confidential, or confidential health information, or confidential financial information is confidential. So under no circumstances should that be released. Still public record, just not disclosable public record. The third category is what is called discretionary release. So that places the decision or the authority to make the decision on the public agency. They can choose whether to release that or not. They have the discretion to do so. Deliberative material is one. Deliberative material is something that, throughout the course of your operations, you have put down on paper your thoughts, your opinions. You've emailed a colleague with your take on an issue. It's not factual. It's your opinion. That's deliberative. And the legislature has carved out an exception that says, if you want to give that out, you can, but if you think that would compromise your decision-making process for others to know kind of the peeking behind the blanket or peeking behind the curtain of your mind, then the legislature says it's okay if you want to withhold that, you can. And we'll get in a little more detail about that here briefly, but it's important to note that of those three kind, we start with the overall philosophy that it's all public record, but then we carve out exceptions from there. Quickly, with the APRA, there's some deadlines that you have to be mindful of. The first is that if somebody comes to you and asks for a public record in person, somebody actually comes to your office and delivers a public records request, you have 24 hours to respond to that request. Now, the response can be simultaneous, and the response is in the production of the document. That you have more time than 24 hours to actually produce the document. This is just to respond, just to acknowledge their request. That's all you need to do. And it can be simultaneous at the time of the request. It can be an administrative person at the front desk saying, okay, we've received your request, we'll begin working on it immediately. Now, best practice is that you have that in writing so that a requester can't deny that they received acknowledgement of the request. So what I tell folks is to have some kind of boilerplate language in a letter that says, thank you for your public records request, we will work on it. Have somebody sign it and just turn it over right there. That's their acknowledgement. That's all that's needed. So an in-person request, that first deadline can be satisfied immediately. Now, if you get something in writing or over the fax machine or over the email that says, I'm looking for a public record, if it's in writing like that, you have 7 days to acknowledge that request. So a little more flexibility. But at the same time, it should be pretty easy to send out a letter saying, I acknowledge your request, we're working on it. So if you do that, that first hurdle is overcome just by sending out a letter that looks like that. Pretty simple. Now, after that, after you've acknowledged their request, you now have a reasonable time to actually produce the document they're looking for. Or, in the alternative, deny if it falls into a certain category. So what is a reasonable period of time? Well, that's going to be a case-by-case basis. If they're looking for last month's meeting minutes and they've already been voted on and approved, and you have copies of that readily available, a reasonable amount of time should be a few days at most. Pretty easy to get that to them. If they're looking for some kind of historical document or data or a complex request that may take some research, may take some redacting if it contains certain kinds of information, then that reasonable amount of time stretches out a little bit. It's not your obligation to drop everything for a request, but it is your obligation to integrate access production in the course of your duties. So that doesn't mean you have to dedicate someone full-time for public records requests. And I know some of you get more records requests than others, but it doesn't mean that you have to have one staff member solely devoted to that. It doesn't mean that you have to be solely devoted to that, and every time it comes in, you have to sound the alarm and gird yourself for a big research project. That's not what this means. It just means that you have to be, in good faith, diligent about being mindful of this and working on it, as you can, and producing documents accordingly. A question over here?
What if they request we filter documents? That is, if they ask for documents that are over $1,000 maybe or something like that, are we required to do filtering for them?
So the question is about filtering documents, or basically what I'm hearing is doing the research for them. So someone comes in and asks for all your invoices over $1,000. The next slide will talk about reasonable particularity and what that means. And basically that an individual requester has to identify with some kind of specificity what document they're looking for. All invoices over $1,000, that's going to be a fairly broad request. Maybe you have that readily available. Maybe you organize your office in that way. Maybe you have, here's a stack of invoices over 500, here's over 1,000, here's over 10,000, whatever it may be. But you don't necessarily have those. And what I find now is that out-of-state companies, data miners, will call looking for those kinds of things. And say, I want a list of all your vendors or all your contractors or all of your invoices. And usually I tell folks, I say, you can write them back and say, that's not reasonably particular, can you narrow down your request? And that's fine. If in your subjective determination, something's not reasonably specific enough, ask them to narrow down their request. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes some of these big out-of-state data miners, sometimes that's enough for them to say, we don't want to mess with it, and they'll just forget about the request altogether. Now, I don't necessarily condone that either, but they're looking for this information to sell it for a profit. And so when it comes to those commercial enterprises, I'm a little more lenient on what you have to do. Question?
Can you tell them the hours that you're open and invite them to come and research it, which I've done?
Yes, you can do that as well. Sometimes that's the best way to do it because they're on a little bit of a fishing expedition. They're trying to search around in the dark for something. They can't pinpoint with pinpoint accuracy what they're looking for. And so can they come in and take a look at your files? If it's a set of files that doesn't contain any kind of confidential information, by all means, invite them in, have them look through it. Usually it's a good idea to have someone kind of sit with them, make sure those kinds of things don't walk off or get shuffled out of place or things like that. But yeah, that's perfectly acceptable. If they don't necessarily want a copy, they're entitled to a copy, but if they just want to look, have them come on in and take notes, basically. So with one more thing about reasonable period of time, say there is that huge request where there's no way out of it, you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to generate copies of a large request. How do you disclose those? I generally say don't wait until everything's compiled, and it could take months to compile everything, to disclose that and produce it to a requester. Kind of trickle it out as it becomes available. You work on, a set of 30 pages one day, 30 pages the next day. As they become available, as you go through them, redact what needs to be redacted, review what needs to be reviewed, and dole them out on a piecemeal manner. What I find, that satisfies the requester's anxiety as to, oh, they're not working on it, they've just forgotten about me, when really you've just waited until the end to produce everything. But if you kind of dribble it out as it becomes available, I think that's the best way to do it. Shows that you're still working on it and things like that. So I mentioned reasonable particularity. There's a burden placed on a requester to identify a document with some kind of specificity. Now, they might not know exactly what the form is called, or they might not know exactly what what the date of the email communication is. But if they give a reasonable enough description of what they're looking for, then that then shifts the burden to you to at least search for and decide whether it's disclosable or not. Email's the best example of this. People will come into your office and say, well, I want all your emails from 2013. Where do you start? That's not a reasonable particular request. But if they come in and they identify a date range, say, okay, I want all your emails from 2013 between you and Commissioner Smith regarding the budget for the county road project or whatever. That identifies with some kind of particularity what they're looking for. An email set that you can type in a keyword, there's a search parameter, county road project or whatever that might be. You only have to look at a named accounts. You don't have to go fishing through all of your staff members, and a tight enough date range that it won't yield 10,000 documents, that maybe it'll only yield 40 emails. And you can go through those pretty quickly, decide what you want to release, what you don't want to release, and go from there. So that's what reasonable particularity means, that they have to identify with some kind of specificity. Here again, we've talked about the three different kinds of public records, that I categorize. So it must be disclosed, it's been declared confidential, and discretionary. Again, confidential are things like financial information of a taxpayer, or social security numbers are always going to be confidential. Trade secrets, things like that. This list isn't exhaustive. There's another, this is another category where the laws affecting confidentiality are sprinkled throughout not only Indiana statute, but also federal statute. Things like FERPA and HIPAA and things like that are all going to contain some kind of guidance on what's confidential and what's not. So this is where you kind of have to ask your county attorney, all right, we have this set of information, is it disclosable, and it's not, and then the attorney makes the decision whether a law has declared that confidential or not. Discretionary categories, there are about 30 of these in the Access to Public Records Act. These are things that haven't been declared confidential, but the legislature has decided to include or to give the agency the choice as to whether or not they want to disclose that. And the biggest one I see is the deliberative material exception, where, again, if you've discussed something with a colleague and you put it in writing, if you send an email to a staff member about some kind of opinion that you have or an idea for an initiative, not hard facts, but just everyday communication. The legislature has said that you don't necessarily have to reveal those if it would compromise the integrity of the decision-making process. Now, if it's innocuous information and you're okay with releasing it, please do so. Don't withhold things just because you can. Have a reason for it Don't just say, oh, it's deliberative, so therefore you can't have it. Curate those records a little more closely than that, and use these exceptions judiciously again. Just because they're there doesn't mean you have to use them, and doesn't mean you should use them every single time. Now, when it comes to things like personnel files or investigatory records of law enforcement, there's a reason behind using that discretion, and so those things are going to be a little different than the deliberative materials. But just be mindful that my expectation is that you use these exceptions judiciously. So, say you've decided to deny something. Either they've requested a confidential document, or they've requested something that you have made the decision not to disclose because it's been declared discretionary by law. You can deny an oral request, an in-person request. You can deny that in person and orally. I don't recommend it. I say always have a paper trail, just so that if you can go back and see, or I can go back and see if there's if you've put that in writing. I know the motivation behind your denial. And I think it's always best practice anyway to have a paper trail of these kinds of things. So even though you're allowed to deny an in-person request orally, put it in writing anyway. But if that request was made in writing, then there is an obligation. You have to deny it in writing as well. And you have to state the justification for the denial and the decision maker. So if the county attorney decided, "Oh, we're not going to release that," you have to say it was the county attorney's decision. If it was your decision, you have to say it was my decision. If it was a commissioner, you get the idea. So if it's in writing, then put the denial in writing as well. Any questions so far? Yes.
That personnel files, oh, good, thank you. That personnel files, there's certain information that you have to, give out. It says business telephone number. We do for like home numbers, we do redact those. Is that proper?
Yes.
Okay.
That's information that isn't required to be released. If she's talking about the very last exception here, it's personnel files under the APRA is kind of an exception within an exception. So personnel files generally are exempt from disclosure, except for those enumerated things. And those are business-related things. So, business address and telephone number, not home address and telephone number. They may be in the personnel file, but you can withhold that because that compromises the privacy of your employee. But with things that are related to their official capacity, the public has the right to know, more or less.
We also ask that on our homestead deductions, and so if someone would want to see that information, that would be, we redact that too. It's their home phone number.
The law isn't clear on that, but I don't know of a statute which would preclude the release of that. So if someone were to push the issue, I'm not sure that I could say, okay, you're allowed to redact it or not. I think it's probably okay that you do it initially. Just know that if somebody pushes the issue, that you may have to release that eventually. But that's fine. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
If an employee submits a written complaint against another employee or their boss, where does that fall?
So employee grievances against one another, where would that be? Typically, I would consider that to be a personnel issue that would be intended to go in a personnel file. So I would say that wouldn't have to be disclosed if you choose not to, because that's a typical personnel file thing. It also could be considered deliberative because that's one person's opinion about another employee as well. So you can exercise that exception and exercise your discretion that way. But with personnel files, it's more about the intention. Is this intended to be in a personnel file? So, performance appraisals. Well, that has to do with your personnel file. That goes in your personnel file. So that you may choose not to release, personnel file or performance appraisals. But don't take something that's so far removed from personnel and try to hide it by putting it in a personnel file. It's the intention of what was intended for that document to be. What category was that supposed to be in? Another question?
Would you please explain again about the subcommittee? You were saying something about it becomes a new delegation, and if there are 3 people, then 2 people would be the quorum?
Yes.
And then you have to be there 2 out of, if more than 2, or how did that work again? About it becoming open door
Yeah.
and publicized?
So a subcommittee is formed by the original governing body of, say, 3 people. 2 out of 3 establishes a majority. So anytime 2 of the 3 of that subcommittee meets to discuss public business, then they're subject to the open door law. And they would also have to place notice that they are meeting. Now, if it's not an official subcommittee, if it's not an official delegation, if 3 of the 7 members want to meet to discuss an issue, and they've organically formed that, that's not a set subcommittee that was established by the original governing body, then that's fine, because that's just a minority group of members meeting. That's not a subcommittee or delegation. It has to be declared an official subcommittee in order for it to be subject to the open door law. Or circumstantially, it can't be just a wink and a nudge that, hey, let's form this committee, but not call it a committee. If it arises organically, if it's just a group of members, a minority group of members discussing, that's fine. Yeah. Any other questions about that? Okay. Let's talk about email briefly. And I'm running a little short on time, but I will talk about email because this came up recently, and I've been getting a lot of questions about it. Digital information, email, it's public record, and you have to carve out an exception from there if applicable. But the big question is becoming, okay, I use a Yahoo account or a Gmail account to conduct my public business. I don't have a county server, or I don't have a city server upon which to do my business in my official capacity. That account as a whole is not public record. So someone cannot come into my home and request, my computer, even though I conduct public business on my Yahoo account. People can't take my smartphone if it's my personal smartphone and take a look at it. But I think the philosophy of access and transparency is that the actual individual emails that you write as a public official, those emails should be public record. Now, if you use the same account to conduct your personal business, that's not public record. So this doesn't apply to the entire account. But if you use your phone, your smartphone, to text a fellow commissioner about a road project or an initiative or something like that affects public business, that text message should be considered public record. And if someone asks for those, you should at least know that it's potentially disclosable. Okay? So officials can't hide behind their personal Yahoo account to do all of their public business. Now, there's really no way to enforce that, and so public employees are kind of on the honor system to keep those and retain those like they would if they were on a regular authorized government server. But my feeling is that eventually that's going to wind up in a court case, or the legislature is going to research that and decide whether to put it in law or not. And I'm laying the foundation, here by telling folks that even though there's no set authority saying that your personal emails regarding public business are public record, there's no authority for that. I'm saying that you should consider that. As best practice, you should consider them to be public record. Any questions about that? Because that's kind of controversial, and people don't like that very much. But my take on it is that if you're acting in your official capacity as a public employee and you put something in writing, regardless of the forum, you should consider that public record and you should retain that accordingly. Everything else that you do on your personal time is your personal time. So if you're not acting in your official capacity, there's no problem. You don't have to keep those emails. But those emails that you use or those text messages that you send regarding public business, you should consider public record. Yes?
I have a public and a private or a business. I have a Gmail account and that I do all my, political and other things in regards to. But then I have, the county's email. What happens is that some people don't know my private email, so they send things to me to my county email. So I try to just forward them on to my, and then delete them. But someone has actually asked for a public request of my emails before because of political things. So, but, I was very careful, so, nothing came of it. But, I think, am I doing the right thing by just forwarding them to and then trying to delete everything that I can?
Well, as long as there's going to be one digital file there, either on your personal account or on the server, as long as you've retained a copy of it, then you're okay. You don't have to keep multiple digital copies of emails, but you're kind of on the honor system here too, so that if something winds up in your personal email account, my feeling is that you're accountable to retain those as if it were on the county server. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It makes sense after he explained it.
Okay. Thanks. Question back here.
I get solicitations from vendors who would like to do business with the county. I get invitations to a picnic or from the Chamber of Commerce. Are those types of communications ones that need to be preserved, or are we permitted to delete things that might be considered junk mail?
Yeah, junk mail and things like that, unsolicited, email blasts, things like that. Those are considered what the Committee on Public Records or Commission on Public Records considers transitory. So they don't have to do with public business necessarily. They aren't really policy related or operational in nature, and so they wouldn't necessarily be subject to the retention schedule. The county and local municipalities have a set retention schedule where they have to keep certain documents for a certain amount of time. Some have to be kept forever. Some can be deleted or destroyed after 3 years or 7 years or 10 years. But that retention schedule, sets the guidelines for those kinds of things. But those kinds of things would be transitory. If you respond in your official capacity, then it should be retained. But if it's just an unsolicited email blast or junk mail, I get that stuff all the time too, even on my state server. I get, LinkedIn requests and things like that that are unsolicited. I delete those and don't pay it any mind. So that's perfectly acceptable. Couple more questions, yeah.
Each time I email the council the minutes, basically the email says, here are the minutes.
Yeah.
We have those minutes. Is there any reason to keep that email that I sent?
So you email a copy of the minutes to your council or commission. And so do you have to keep the digital copy as well as the physical copy? Is that what you're saying?
Right, basically the email just says, here are your minutes. And then the minutes, of course, are stored in the
There's a
minutes.
physical copy
Yeah.
somewhere. Well, again, that's duplicative.
I mean, you get
It's
into
kind of
emails and
transitory.
you have so many emails.
Right. That's more of a question for the Commission on Public Records who sets those retention schedules. I don't really do that as much. So I don't know what the state archivist feeling is on those kind of duplicative copies. My feeling is that he'd be okay with deleting the digital copy as long as it contained the same exact information as what's on hard paper. But I really couldn't answer that right now. You'd have to check in with them. Yes.
What if a information request is sent to the person's personal email as opposed to the business email or their personal smartphone?
Yeah, if a request for a public record, you mean, is made to a person's personal email, that puts you on notice as a public employee that a request has been made. So I think the same obligation would apply regardless of whether it was made, regardless of where it was made. So if it was, if it's sent to your personal email account, if a requester has that address and they send it to you, I still think that puts you on the hook to respond, at least, and then follow up. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Well, I will put my contact information up here. Please feel free. I know we rushed through this stuff, and I probably didn't cover everything, but I'd be more than willing to have a conversation with you in the future about how this affects what you do. Thank you for your attention this morning and your participation and your questions. I really appreciate it. I'll stick around for a little bit if anybody has any questions. But again, thank you, and I appreciate your time.